You know, delivering excellence is more than just 18 wheels moving products around the country. Trucking is complex, and its people are passionate. Accommodating a diverse driving workforce, ever-changing regulations, supply chain demands, and new technologies all present their own challenges, but in trucking, the creative and the innovative succeed. Let's understand the people that drive and support the trucking industry, and welcome to Garner Trucking's Beyond the Cab. Hello and welcome to another edition of Beyond the Cab. I'm your host, Tim Krolsky, and today I've got a very special guest with me, and I want to kind of set him up a little bit. A lot of great information. So today I'm taking a different perspective. Typically, as trucking companies talk specifically about brokerage houses, there's always that kind of negative connotation that can come with that. And I really wanted to kind of get inside of why that is, a little bit about the brokerage perspective and how trucking companies can leverage and use a brokerage service to the best of both the brokers and the carrier's position. The individual I have on the phone with me today is Thomas TK Bardwell, and we're going to continue by calling him TK. He is the VP of Logistics for BR Williams, a company that is located, headquartered out of Oxford, Alabama. Started back in 1958, so a long-running history. I actually know the owner pretty well. We've had some benchmarking groups and experiences in the past, so I've got a lot of experience at what a great organization they're running down at BR Williams. They've got facilities all over, and I'm going to let TK talk a little bit about those, but a fleet of about 165 tractors, 625 van trailers, and they service the continental United States, all 48 states. As far as TK is concerned, joined BR Williams in 2000. He was a full-time truck driver and consequently kind of follows a similar path to what I have in the transportation world. Went part-time in 2002. He drove part-time through the next 4 years until he graduated from JSU with a degree in economics. After graduation, TK worked for 4 years with C.H. Robinson, another brokerage house that we use and many carriers throughout the United States and frankly across the world might use, and was a branch manager for mobile in 2010. TK was also asked to come back then to BR Williams and start up their logistics division. Here we are 11 years later, and they're moving about 10,000 truckloads annually with 10 team members. So, TK, you've had a bit of success in the third party industry, correct?
Well, it's been a grind, but definitely feel like we have it moving in the right direction. We're on a good trajectory.
For sure, I would say that's more than successful. So, in the first place, I always like to take a step back, TK, and kind of get inside of where did all this begin? How did this start for you? So, what brought you to the trucking industry?
Well, like many of us, right out of high school, I wasn't 100% certain what I wanted to do, and spent a couple of years trying to figure that out. Not really having a whole lot of success. I took a couple of stabs at college, but I really wasn't that interested in it and wasn't very successful in my first couple of attempts. And I mentioned my daughter to you earlier. Well, finding out that I was going to be a dad and that she was on the way is what kind of lit a fire in my belly to learn a skill of some kind. And I had passed by a trucking school many times near my house and thought I'd walk in there and talk to them. And also, I had always loved travel, so I thought I could kill two birds and learn an important marketable skill and maybe get a little travel in and get moving in the right direction, literally and figuratively in gear. So I went through the trucking school and went to work for a large carrier. That I'm sure many of the drivers that are listening to your podcast that have worked for a large carrier in the past could attest to the fact that it doesn't work out for a lot of them. It wasn't a great experience for me. I really wanted to work for a company that knew my name and knew that I exist and cared that I existed. So I found that with another company locally there, with BR Williams. I started with them in July of 2000. That was my introduction really to the trucking industry and learning how to do it. And what it was about and how it all flows and how you interact with shippers and plants and things of that nature.
I think it's interesting too, and we had talked a bit before, actually a couple of times now, but we've kind of walked similar paths in lives. I have almost the same type of description for my beginnings in trucking that you do. So it's always interesting to me to kind of hear those stories. Knowing that you've come from that trucking background, obviously you've had some experience with the trucking portion, the carrier operations portion of things. What would you say are the differences between now operating a brokerage versus how a carrier operates?
Well, there's quite a few differences and quite a few similarities as well. But I'd say the main difference is that a broker that is acting as an intermediary is both buying and selling. Buying the transportation services and then reselling as intermediary those services to the shipper. It's also, and this is more finance than it is operations, but a brokerage is a variable cost model. So our primary expense, which is purchase transportation, tends to move in line with our revenues. So it's a bit of a safer model. Whereas your trucking operation is a lot more capital intensive, a lot more fixed costs. So there's a great deal more.
Minus fuel.
Oh, right, of course. Now there's quite a bit of variable as well, but I'm sure, as you know, the fixed cost element is huge. If you've got trucks sitting against the fence with no drivers in them, you're not accumulating the miles that are needed in aggregate and not covering your fixed costs. That is very problematic, and we've had markets where that's been the case. So for a broker, it's a more safe business model, but it also comes with some limitations as well. Namely, you can't make a truck appear. You don't have any trucks that you own that you can say, yes, customer, we find your business to be a great fit for us, and we're willing to dedicate 12 trucks or whatever the case may be. A broker has to be very creative with how they go about doing that, and because of that, they all have very different approaches that vary from being either highly transactional, as many of the scale model brokers that you think of, TQL, et cetera, are, versus more density-based model, more of a contractual type. That's more how we go about things.
So what do you see as some of the similarities? You had mentioned that a little bit earlier. What do you see as the similarities between a carrier and a brokerage house or a third party?
Well, the similarities are mostly how we interact with customers and a lot of the technologies that we have to utilize in order to integrate with the customers, with the shippers. The kinds of reporting that they like to see, whether it's going on an asset or it's going on a brokerage carrier.
I have an answer for one of the questions I want to ask you, but before I give you my kind of take on things, in your estimations, why do you think that trucking companies will typically use a brokerage service?
Well, it's an interesting dynamic. There are very few barriers to entry for becoming a carrier, a motor carrier. A guy that has driven before that decides, hey, you know what, I want to own my own business. It's not very difficult if he's got decent credit and a little bit of money in the bank, to buy a truck and to go out on his own or her own and do this. So whereas, let's say, compared to, I don't know, if you wanted to be a manufacturer or if you wanted to own a restaurant, it's a lot more difficult. You got to come up with a lot more capital, get employees and all kinds of things. So that's one of the beauties of the trucking industry, that everyone from the one truck operation to Mr. C.L. Werner himself that started off as a one truck operation, and for Mr. BR Williams that started off as a two truck operation, So it's great. But so think about your typical carrier, and the fleet sizes they run from one truck all the way up to, I think Schneider's at nearly 20,000 or something like that if we're talking about truckload carriers and everything in between. But 70% of the trucks on the road belong to carriers that have 500 trucks or less, right? So those types of carriers, like a Garner, like a BR Williams, we don't have. It doesn't make any sense for us to have the kind of sales resources that it would take to sell to shippers all over the country. Not only to sell to shippers all over the country, but to sell to shippers very limited services, right? So, let's say for us, we're located in Alabama. We've got customers to send us to Pennsylvania and Texas, Utah, you name it. For us to contact shippers in those areas and say, hey, we need freight. We'd love to service your account. By the way, we can only go back to Alabama or to Ohio. It's not something that resonates with the shipper community. So what a broker does for the shipper is they can take freight going to any region, any part. So they're not saying no frequently. They say yes. Shipper calls them and they've got 15, 20 loads, whatever the case may be, going all over the country. They can say yes to all. And for the carrier who's reaching out to the broker needing to get back to Alabama, because they take freight going anywhere, they're that much more likely to have the kind of freight that works perfectly and places our equipment exactly where it needs to be.
Well, I think that's an interesting point, and one thing that we've worked hard on as an organization to really stray away from kind of the random nature. Obviously everybody and their brother kind of has this brokerage house. As you point out, it's a little easier to start that up because you don't have those assets that you need to worry about. But one of the things that we've worked very hard on as an organization is getting to a place where we're building relationships with brokerage houses that have that freight, because for the reasons you're pointing out, we're not able to offer this vast coverage area because we're based in Findlay, Ohio. So we need those trucks to come back this way, and I can't afford to send that truck to Atlanta, Georgia, or to Alabama or wherever else we're talking about, because we've got customers that have demands that we need to take care of back in this corner of the country. So building those relationships and finding those points where it makes sense, not only for the service end of things, but also from the financial piece. And we've found other opportunities over the years with brokers where maybe there's a dedicated piece of business that they've been able to capture, again, because of those sales resources that they have, that we wouldn't even be, a company wouldn't even entertain, based on our size or our footprint. So being able to at least come to some agreement there that makes sense from a business perspective. Now, the flip side of all of that is when we get into a situation where, maybe those normal corridors or those normal opportunities for a brokerage house, and this is the part where a driver can get fired up. Now I've got to send you to some new location that we've never been to before, and there's a 4-hour wait, or there's the bad attitude on the dock, or difficult location to get into, and all those kind of quote unquote problems that you can have with a broker load because we're not familiar with the customer that can arise. And of course, I think as human beings, we have a real tendency to remember the bad things. This one time this happened, versus, a lot of the good things that do go on. And quite frankly, we kind of put a barrier in place between the brokerage houses and our drivers so that we're handling those calls and dealing with those things. But the only time they're going to know it's a broker load is when there's a problem and they have to call in and we have to get answers from a third party. So, those are the things I think sometimes that stick in a driver's mind as to, why are we doing these loads? Why are we using a broker for this? But that's, I think, a tremendous explanation on, from the brokerage side of the house on why that freight's available for you folks, and it isn't for the carrier, especially when you're talking about a mom and pop carrier like a Garner Trucking. What would you say at this time, TK, are you seeing in the trucking industry that are impacting it? What problem areas, those types of things, are you seeing from your perspective?
Oh my gosh, I wouldn't even know where to start on that. But before we get to that, I wanted to go back to what you said about the fact that you guys have been very intentional about helping to insulate your drivers from a lot of these brokers. I think that's a fantastic idea and a great service that you do for your drivers. And also, it sounds like you're very intentional about limiting those new lanes, locations, and the number of brokers that you work with, such that those instances where there tends to be more problems with a new location and things like that are minimized. So I think that's very, very smart of you guys, and also it's far more efficient, to work with the same brokers that you can trust, because you know that at some point the tide's going to go out. Something's going to happen. There's going to be a claim or a shortage or whatever the case may be, and relationship means everything when those things happen. It's just a law of averages. They're going to, but as far as the communication with the broker, the communication with the shipper, all the way down to the driver knows that he asked for Jason, and he walks in between dock 2 and 3, and that kind of thing, instead of wandering throughout the property trying to find out where he is. It's easier for everyone. It's more enjoyable for everyone, and it's more efficient for all involved.
I agree.
So kudos to you guys.
Yeah. Where's the shipping door? Where's the receiving door? Yeah, those things come up, and as former drivers, I think we both have probably had those experiences. Would you say, from your experience, is there a difference between working with a regular carrier driver versus an owner-operator? Do you have a lot of experience with owner-operators?
We have a fair amount of experience, but I'll tell you, our model being more contractual, we quite honestly we look for companies that are like Garner and like BR Williams. We find good fits for lanes and work with them again and again and again. There's a role certainly for some owner operators. We have some local expedited type business that works pretty well. We also work with one of the larger carriers that has almost exclusively owner operators, and they do a great job for us on certain types of business. But the approach, there does seem to be maybe a greater sense of pride for some of the owner operators than the new company drivers. Now, the company drivers that have been around for some time, I don't see much difference at all.
Would you say there's a difference between, again, from your perspective, between working for a carrier that has a brokerage versus strictly using someone like maybe a C.H. Robinson? And I only use them just because they're one of the largest and most popular in the country. Do you feel there's some distinguishing differences there?
From my perspective, is there a difference in me having been employed by a company that is both asset and non-asset versus strictly non-asset?
Yep, you got it.
Oh, yeah. So, well, a company like that is entirely non-asset, of course, has limitations. Some of those I mentioned earlier. But because they're a scale model, they do tend to put a lot more resources into sales. They grow that scale, and it is efficient. Like you said, you deal with C.H. Robinson because they have so much freight. It's so much more likely that you're going to be able to find what it is that you're looking for your driver, for your truck. They're also able to, as it makes sense, acquire other types of companies, give them additional capabilities modally. So they're largely mode neutral, in that they don't care if it goes LTL or truckload or intermodal or air, whatever the case may be. So they're not tied to one mode or another, and that's something that a lot of shippers with a certain mix of business that appeals to them very much. However, there of course are limitations, and the biggest one being that they don't own a single truck. They cannot commit assets that they don't own. So they're also not able to tailor make solutions that would include both assets and non-assets for a shipper that would optimize the benefits of both. Take for example a shipper that we have in Alabama that ships to California and ships to PA, ships to New York. Well, on the brokerage side, we're able to go to the West Coast far more efficiently than our asset side. Our asset side is able to go to the Northeast far more efficiently than we're able to. So having both, we're able to combine and offer an optimal solution.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinguishing piece, when you start talking about a company that owns both the brokerage and the assets to back some things up. It's got to be helpful. Would you say that, I hate even to use this word, but COVID's really kind of changed things over the last several years from the carrier perspective. But I literally know nothing, and I'm certain our drivers probably don't either in terms of the demands from customers and the carriers when it comes to what's changed in the past few years. What would you say those changes are? The dynamic differences between operating a brokerage house in 2019 versus now in 2022.
Well, I think, some is related to COVID, but largely it was just kind of the way things were going, the trajectory that things were on, and that's that they're requiring better data, more integrations, EDI, third-party telemetry, things of that nature, better ETAs, reporting, KPIs, things of that nature, and I'd say that the carriers are doing their part. A lot of these technologies are far more scalable than they were. So, 20 years ago when a customer asked for this, or 15 years ago even, carriers either had the resources to have like programming, software programming type folks on staff that could build those types of tools, or they didn't. And they were just on the outside looking in for those shippers that demanded those types of things. But now those services are really available to any company of any size, mostly scalable. So carriers also, and this is one of the key changes that I've seen over the past couple of years, asset-based carriers are beginning to finally demand from the shippers what it is that they need, be it shippers of choice initiatives like keeping their detention down and things like that. And, including rates as well, all of which being commensurate with their risk. And that's something in years past that we haven't seen.
I think that's a really important point that I think I've said this a lot when it comes to the last couple of years, because it's forced, I think, every segment of the industry, including shippers and receivers, to learn how to communicate best practices to one another, communicate just kind of the simple do's and don'ts that are needed in order to be successful. And I think now, for the first time, that both sides of the house are actually willing to listen to and have those conversations, because they realize, first of all, the value of a very shallow truck driver market in terms of the quantity of drivers that are out on the road for whatever reason you want to list. I think it's become imperative to all, and it's opened up that pathway to be able to have some real honest and open conversations with your customer base. And to me, that's all for the good. That's all for the better. If there's one thing I've said about COVID since the beginning that's been a plus, it's that. We're learning how to communicate better with our customers, our drivers, our people, effectively doing it in multiple ways. This podcast started a little before COVID, but now has been a catalyst, a means of communication back to our fleet and to anyone else who's interested about the industry. So it's amazing, all these tools and things that are in place now that help us communicate better. But I think rock solid point, TK, as far as what the real impact of these last couple of years have been. Also interesting to me that you mentioned communication in regard to what we're doing and how we're speaking with customers. But what do you find today that maybe wasn't in existence 5-6 years ago in terms of technology existing or new things that you're using at BR Williams to communicate with drivers and to customers?
Yeah, so that's an interesting dynamic, because there is a balance there. What you can automate today versus what you could automate 5 years ago, and I mean in a practical sense. Of course, you could automate anything, but you can practically do it now to where it makes sense, and you can automate quite a bit of your communication with your customers, sending automated emails, things of that nature, reminding them that you're there and that you are interested in their freight or whatever the case may be, communicating with drivers, etc. But we don't want to lose that human touch. Relationships with our customers, with our drivers, with our contract carriers. It's everything. It's what makes us valid in a sustainable industry. So if you look 150, 200 years into the future, whenever, when trucks are entirely, autonomous or whatever, if that ever happens, what will go away is that human touch. And I think having relationships with people across the board and through the supply chain that will advocate on your behalf. When you say, hey, look, I need your help. And when you hang up the phone that you can trust them. That human element is something that cannot be automated. So I think that's something that we always want to keep in mind when we're looking at what to automate. Certain communicating operational things, details like truck has arrived, things of that nature. I think largely you can automate most of that, but I wouldn't want to get in the business of automating all of that. So if that answers your question.
It sure does. You think you bring up another interesting point too, because we see it every day, and maybe you do too. Our younger generation of drivers certainly demand different forms of communication than what maybe an older driver does. And kind of relative to your point on that human touch, I'm curious, what do you see? Do you see much difference between an older driver versus a younger driver and how they want to be communicated with, what they're willing to do, what they're not willing to do? Are you texting more, emails more, those types of things with the driver, or still generally getting phone calls?
I think the older driver. Well, first off, let me say this: the older drivers, and I mean those that have been driving for 10, 15 plus years or whatever, tend to be the best drivers, the most reliable, the ones that you have to check on the least, or at least that's been our experience. And of course, there are many exceptions to that. Sure. Many new drivers that are doing a great job, but in general, your old timers are failure wasn't an option. Being reliable is very, very important to them, and maybe more so than some of the millennials and younger folks. And again, I'm generalizing, but they are definitely less apt to adopt new technologies, download an app on their phone, things of that nature, or deal with calls and text messages from brokers that they don't know, for instance. So I think the direction that this is going, now it may take some time, but the direction that this is going is that most of the telemetry and information that is needed by the broker, but essentially downstream by the shipper, is going to come from that ELD. And it's just a matter of gathering it and where that information is able to flow. It's going to be more difficult for the large-scale, more transactional brokers like your Coyote, TQL, et cetera, to gather that from the ELDs. I say that I'm not an expert on this. It may be in some sense easier for them because they may have a bit more leverage in some areas. But I'll say this: your more transactional brokers are going to have to rely on driver smartphones for a longer period of time, whereas the more contractual, like our model, where we move 80% of our freight with our top 20% of carriers. We're going to be able to get those carriers to sign up and give us access to the telemetry on their ELDs and never have to bother their drivers. And it's not just a matter of bothering the drivers. It's also a matter of a lot of that information being unreliable. When they turn their phone off, for instance, and we have no idea where they are at 8 o'clock in the morning, and or maybe they've got Cricket Wireless or something and it doesn't work in this state. Yeah. Who knows? It's just. I mean, we found the success rate for smartphone app-based telemetry to be about 60%, and that is just nowhere near where we need it to be. So the ELD side is more like 90+%. It's doing nothing but improving.
Would you say at this point, is there a difference between the word broker versus a third party? Do you look at those two words as the same thing, or do they mean something different?
Well, they are the same thing technically. But 3PL to me has always been more broad. That's going to be multimodal. That's going to be outsourcing critical components, facets of a shipper supply chain to the third-party logistics company. When you just say broker, sure, that can apply to a Coyote or a Robinson or whoever, and that's true. But they certainly are 3PLs as well. Now, but when I think of broker, I think of a truckload broker. That's what they're doing. They are collecting truckloads and they are brokering those out to carriers. So
a bit
to
more
me,
transactional. If I had to break that down to one word, would you say transactional?
Yes, I would say transactional and modally limited.
Okay, excellent. I have one more question for you, TK, and certainly want to give you the kind of the red carpet rollout for this one. But what would you tell a driver to provide perspective on brokerage houses or broker freight to kind of change their minds?
Well, I would say, and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, why it is that carriers deal with brokers and why do shippers deal with brokers. And I would say that first and foremost, the existence of brokers is what allows for small carriers to exist. It's never going to make sense for a 10-truck operation, a 1-truck operation, a 50-truck operation to go all over the country and to solicit freight from shippers everywhere. It's just not going to make sense. So brokers are always going to be a necessity for that reason. So do keep that in mind. Now that doesn't mean by any stretch that drivers should tolerate brokers that are anything but professional and friendly with them. And many brokers, that's part of their culture, is that they're sort of needlessly toxic with drivers. And I find that to be completely counterproductive, and really for no purpose whatsoever. And it's something that has given many brokers a bad name. That the drivers will talk to a broker and have one be condescending and rude to them, and not want to deal with them again in the future. And the brokers accomplish nothing in doing that. So. I would also tell them that when they have experiences like that, to make sure and bring that back to their dispatchers and let them know that you're not paid to take abuse from people. I
agree with that. I think that especially when you start talking about that world, again, I kind of shared our perspective that there really is a need and value in building those relationships with the brokerage or third party that it makes sense to do that with. And I think it's even more imperative that both the carrier and the brokerage house understand that there's a human being that's behind the wheel, and that there are going to be problems. And when those problems are there, that we're able to work through them pretty easily and with respect to the human being behind the wheel. TK, as we wrap up today, I want to make sure I thank you again for your time today. Again, this has kind of been a bit against the grain of what we've done in the past, and we're looking to kind of blaze a trail towards different topics to present to our drivers. But I also want to give you the respect of mentioning BR Williams and a little bit about your services. Again, kind of a free commercial for you. And I want to close with maybe where your locations are, what services you provide in case any of the listeners might have an interest in using some of those services.
Oh, great. Well, I appreciate that very much. We are an asset-based carrier with 3 divisions: our trucking division, our logistics, which is brokerage, and our fulfillment and distribution, or warehousing division as well. So, headquartered in Oxford, Alabama. We run fleets out of Oxford, Alabama, East Tavoga, Alabama, right next to the Talladega Superspeedway, if you're a NASCAR fan, and Mobile, Alabama. Our fulfillment centers are located in Mobile and Tallahassee, Florida, East Tavoga, Alabama, and 2 in Anniston, Alabama, 1 in Piedmont, Alabama. We've been diversifying services over the last 3 to 4 years to where we've moved from sort of a model of pallet in, pallet out long-term storage to more kitting, program management, light assembly, quality inspections, and full-on e-commerce, B2B and B2C fulfillment.
TK, thanks again so much. You've been listening to TK Bardwell, the VP of Logistics for BR Williams, and now someone I can consider a friend and look forward to seeing in the future. And I want to thank all of you for listening to another edition of Beyond the Cab.